outline, you should been able to see it as you came in. It's on the stand back there. And the subject we're going to look at, I'm going to get my notes, make sure I get it right, but I'm going to bring up somebody that you haven't heard of in many years. Do you remember him? Dr. Jack Kevorkian. What he did in his practice was described as euthanasia, mercy killing, whatever. What you probably did not know is that most of those, in fact, I think it's 60% of those he put to death by his machine, the Kevorkian machine, actually were not terminally ill. They were people suffering from depression. And what a tragedy that is. He was called Dr. Death. He embraced it. He died at 81 years old. And I can't remember what the cause of death was there. But my numbers I just gave you came from Detroit Free Press, the newspaper up there. So very validated. So Dr. Death. Let me give you some thoughts on your outline here. The first is about suicide. What is suicide? I described it as this. It's intentionally causing one's death. And it is a moral dilemma. And suicide has almost become an epidemic in the United States. Let me give you an idea of how bad suicide is in America right now. In 2011, there were 30,000 Americans who committed suicide. In 2020, that number is 45,900 suicides a year. Suicide is the second leading cause of death of 10 to 14-year-olds. I bet you had not heard that before, had you? Suicide is the third leading cause of death for young people 15 to 24 years old. Suicide in the United States is the 12th leading cause of death overall. In 2020, now get this, there were 2 times as many suicides as homicides. You know, we hear on the news all the time, right? Murders in Chicago, murders in Atlanta, murders in Los Angeles. And we hear all of these homicides, and even in our area. But probably what you haven't heard is that suicide is twice the amount as homicides. In fact, I don't know how relevant this one is right now. I wasn't able to get an update. But an average of 1 person dies by suicide every 16.2 minutes. It's amazing. Here's a prediction for you, and it's a sad one. You know all about the transsexual thing going on right now, right? Just all across America. And the surgeries that are taking place. And I hate to predict this, but I believe you can mark this down. You're going to see a marked increase in suicides as a result of those surgeries, you know, that are being done on young people. They're allowing young people to start taking puberty blockers as early as 10 years old. They are allowing procedures of, let's say, young ladies as young as 15 years old to have their breasts removed, double mastectomy. And if you heard, maybe this past week, there was a young lady in front of one of the committees in Washington, and I think her name was Chloe. She was given a testimony that she faced a lot of pressure when she was struggling with her identity. The medical community put so much pressure on her to take the hormone treatments and ultimately the surgeries. And now that she's 18 years old, she is regretting it and has really made her mission in life to be a crusade to warn other parents that don't allow your children, in fact, I think she said, I'm going to put it in my words, but don't allow your children to go to a school counselor because they are empowered to counsel them down that transsexual road. So here's what I think you're going to see. a leap in suicides among young people. It used to be, maybe when I was growing up, you would hear of boys. But sadly, girls now, a tremendous number of girls are taking their own lives. Now think about it. The culture we're living in, and you have all this transsexual, most of them are men or boys that are going that route and allowed to compete in women's sports. So what does that tell the true women? When young men who identify as a female are being able to compete in their sport and actually take the medals for which they have dedicated their life to that sport. You can imagine, right? I mean, sorrow, anger, frustration. It's just an overwhelming sense of sorrow, I think, that is coming. Let me take another thought here. What do you counsel someone that is struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts? And I wanted to suggest three. Very easy, very practical. The first is seek help, right? The second is ask for counsel. And then the third is choose life. Of those there, I think the third one resonates with me. To choose life. You know, how desperate is someone to reject their own life? And how sad that is. Now, I know this is a touchy subject and probably it's not one that you want to hear much about. But here's a question. When somebody takes their own life, I've heard people say, it's the ultimate act of selfishness. Now, let's say that you agree with part of that statement. Why is it selfish? Or is it selfish? Will? Right. But the family, right? Will? They surrender to hopelessness. Chris? Yeah. Especially when there's been a lot of grievance in the home, the family against the parents, and then a young one takes their life, then what does it leave behind? You know, it could be an attack on mom and dad. You know, I'm going to get you back, and you've caused this, you're guilty. And I would think there's a lot of truth in that you carry the rest of your life. A great sorrow that you find there. Anybody else? Yeah. Phil? Wow. Yeah. You know, one thing I read in some of the material as I was studying for this, the vocation that has the highest percentage of suicides, believe it or not, is construction. I was shocked, you know, because you want to think of those guys as hard working, blue collar, you know, and then the states where there's a higher percentage of suicides happens to be in the north, you know, particularly in the north Midwest area. And I've lived up there. Any of you ever lived up in the north? Dark, dreary, overcast. They used to call it up there cabin fever, right? And it can be very depressed. In fact, people started using lamps that could help you change your mood. And I guess that has something to do with vitamin D. Is that right? The lamps and such. So anyway, let me move on. I want to take you to, and if you have your Bible there, 2 Samuel. It's actually 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, because as we go through this, I wanted to make sure that I give you a Bible basis for this. So let me move forward here. All right, so here we are. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 1. In 1 Samuel chapter 31, Saul and his sons have died on the battlefield. Okay? Now, word reaches David about the death of Saul. Now, would you agree that Saul was his enemy, right? Saul spent the last years of his life trying to kill David. So here, I wanted to take you through these verses. They're on the PowerPoint. You have your Bible there too. But let me walk you through this because it really sets up what we're going to look at for the next few minutes. 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 1. Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, David had abode 2 days at Ziklag. Now Ziklag was his headquarters. If you remember a little bit of the background, David had gone to battle with the Philistines, and they were going to battle with Israel. Well, the Philistine generals had a problem with David, the slayer of Goliath, being with them, and so they insisted that David go back home. And so David and his 600 men went back to Ziklag. While he was there, he decided to take a little journey to the Amalekites who had attacked Ziklag. Anyway, to retrieve his family, his possessions. He comes home victorious, but he knew that there was a battle taking place with Saul in Israel. 2 Samuel 1 and verse 2. And it came even to pass on the third day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes rent, earth upon his head. And so it was, when he came to David, that he fell to the earth, and he did obeisance. He bowed before him. And David said unto him, From whence comest thou? And he said unto him, Out of the camp of Israel am I escaped. And David said unto him, How went the matter? I pray thee, tell me. And he answered that the people are fled, the people of Israel are fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen and dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. And David said unto the young man that told him, How knowest thou that Saul and Jonathan his son be dead? And the young man that told him said, As I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. Now remember, Saul had been wounded in battle, right? Somebody had shot an arrow, it had pierced the king, and he was wounded. Now, 2 Samuel 1 verse 7 and 8. And when he looked behind him, he saw me. Now, I don't know what that was, but anyway, when Saul looked behind him, he saw this soldier that's reporting to David, and he called unto me, and I answered him and said, Here am I. And Saul said unto me, the soldier, Who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. Saul said unto me, Stand, I pray thee, upon me. Slay me, for anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. So Saul is saying, Kill me. Although I have been wounded, I'm still life. There's still life in me. Now, verse 10. And so this soldier says, So I stood upon him, upon the king, Saul, and I slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. So this would be an act of mercy, right? That's what this soldier is describing. So he is wounded. He said to me, Kill me. And so I killed him. Going on. And so the soldier says, And I took the crown that was upon his head, the bracelet that was on his arm, and I brought them hither unto my Lord. David took hold on his clothes, and he rent them, his own clothes. Likewise all the men that were with him. They mourned, and they wept, and they fasted until even for Saul. Now Saul had been his enemy, but never to David. David always remembered that Saul was God's anointed. Now I'm going to keep going. And Jonathan his son. And for the people of the Lord, for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. Now here are the 4 dilemmas. And I'm going to fill in the blank quickly. All right? Here we go. The first one, question. The moral dilemma of suicide. Does a man have the moral right to take his own life? Does a man have a moral right to take his own life? No. No. Now, in the world, they would disagree with us on this point. But looking at things through a spiritual lens of God's Word, we have a different perspective. Moving on. Let's look at this for a moment. 1 Samuel 31 and verse 3. The battle went sore against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Verse 4. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, draw thy sword, thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised, the Philistines, come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not kill the king, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and he fell upon it. So my point, the 2 Samuel reported the soldier, I killed the king. That was not true. The king committed suicide. And when the armor bearer for the king, the one that would have helped carry his shield and all into battle, when the armor bearer for the king saw that the king was dead, he then took his own life. Now, there that is. And his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead. He fell likewise upon the sword, died with him. So Saul died, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, all of his men that same day together. Now, moving on then. The moral dilemma. Here's a question. Was it morally right for Saul and his armor bearer to commit suicide by falling on their swords? Now, that's a loaded question. You know why? Because Saul was saying, I'm going to fall into the hands of my enemy. My enemy is going to abuse me, going to torture me, and then finally he's going to kill me. So the attitude of Saul was, I'm going to die anyway. I may as well die on my own sword. That was his spirit. And so some would suggest there's 2 different attitudes about Saul's situation. But the question is, does the morality of death and suicide, does it change? For instance, somebody that has terminal cancer, somebody that has some other ailment that is viewed to be, in the opinion of a doctor, terminal. Well, can we not draw a parallel between where Saul says, I'm mortally wounded and I'm going to die, and a patient who's lying in a bed and they say, well, I'm going to die anyway, so why not be in control of my death? Yes, ma'am. She hasn't seen my outline, by the way. We were so busy, neither one of us were together. Or did you see that one? Well, woman, it's back. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead. Go ahead. The Philistines, sure. It did. All right. Do you want to teach this class? Yeah. All right, all right. Sheila and I were in a hospital several years ago, and the woman in the bed, she wasn't a church member. The woman that was in the bed there, we had visited, and We had visited her a few days before, and she was really not doing well. Well, we visited her again, and she was sitting up. She was eating. There was a sense of joy in the hospital room until a doctor came in. And the doctor said to her, the woman sitting up, having breakfast, and having a glow and a joy about her, said to her, "We've done all that we can do." And did he basically say, "And you're dying"? Yeah. And so literally within probably, 3 days or so, she was dead. The doctor came in and he took away her hope. And the family agreed with the doctor. It was very sad. Say that again? She gave up hope. She surrendered her hope. Yeah. It was very sad. It was. And by the way, that can happen to us. You do understand that, right? It can happen to us. Yes, yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yep. In the battle. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Here's my thought. You might disagree, and that's okay. But I don't think that Saul had the moral right to take his life. But remember, because of his sin, and he had not repented, God had removed his spirit from Saul. And David had been anointed. It was very tragic. Let me keep going because I think it's important for today. God never commends suicide. I wanted to give these 6 names up there. All 6 of these committed suicide in the Scriptures, but they are not commended for having done so. I'm going to keep moving. I could go through each of those, but I won't. All right. God never commends suicide. Number 2, suicide violates life's sanctity and usurps God's authority as the giver of life. I wanted to remind you today, and I'm just going to look quickly at some verses here. And the thought that goes with this is this, that God created man in his image, and God is the author, and he's the giver of life. Just some verses. Genesis 1:27, God created man in his image. Genesis 2, verse 7, the Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground, and man became a living soul. Psalm chapter 8 and verse 5, for thou hast made him, man, a little lower than the angels, and has crowned him with glory and honor. I'm going to give you my opinion. I believe the practice of medicine today, and I know, Doc, there are exceptions, okay? But the practice of medicine today is evolutionary. They do not see you as a living soul created in the likeness and in the image of God. And as a result of that, your life is devalued in their eyes. Your life is of no consequence. It's kind of like we were saying earlier. We're living in a culture that's killing babies and is killing the elderly. The practice of medicine, sadly, is more and more becoming the practice of death. We could go off on another whole tangent of that, but I won't do it. All right. Yes, sir. Oh, the doctor in my crowd. Go ahead, Doc. Say that again. Technology. Wow, yeah. Yeah. So in a sense, the technology has reduced life to a number in the system. Yeah, 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 yeah. It's the institutions have become sanitized. It's lifeless almost. Will? Yeah. Flow chart wisdom. Yeah, yeah. All right. All right. Words of truth still resonate, don't they? They still resonate, Chris? A what? NIH, CDC, you've got all those organizations. Yeah, Kevin. All right. Yeah. So I think we have devalued what it means to give hope. You know, I think one of the great tragedies is what happened during COVID, where loved ones were not able to visit their loved ones in the hospital. And now we know the whole thing with the mask and all, it was a joke. But the difference between life and death might have been a loved one. Right? Let's move on. God commends his people to choose life. I wanted to give you, I think I put this up here. Let me see if I did. Yeah. Here you go. See, I have set before thee this day life and good and death and evil. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 19. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. Don't you love that? That resonates, right? So God tells his people, choose life. Choose life. Doctors will give the diagnosis terminal. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means if you end up in a hospice and they can give you enough morphine that you will be dead, because the morphine's going to start doing what? It's going to start shutting down the major organs. Give enough of it and you're dead. I know I'm practicing medicine, Doc. You'll have to just forgive me. All right, moving on. The moral dilemma of euthanasia. Is it morally right to assist someone who wishes to die? Now, I'm going to move on because of the time. The armor bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Now, what was he afraid of? I think, one, it could be said he was afraid that taking the life of the king probably is not going to be well received. But perhaps it was a fear of God's and his judgment too. So there was a fear of taking the life. Why? Because Saul was, in spite of his failures, he was still, in David's words, God's anointed to be king. Now, moving on, 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 10. So I stood upon him and I slew him because I was sure that he could not live. He was practicing medicine, Doc. Right? Now, remember, Saul had said, I'm whole. There's still life. And so you've got the conflict there. Now, how did David respond to this? Well, I'm going to pick it up at verse 14, 2 Samuel 1:14. David said unto him, the man that said, I killed the king, how wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? You see that? Saul's life was sacred, just like our life is sacred. Just like your loved one's life is sacred. If we could put that back into medicine, it would change the practice of medicine and become what Doc was saying, the art of medicine. Yes? Oh, yeah. Yep. Yep. Well, you had during the whole COVID thing, people like Dr. Zelenko and Dr. McAuliffe and several of those doctors were saying, we are successfully treating COVID and our patients are not dying. And so the response of the medical establishment was, then we're going to outlaw the drugs that you're giving. We're going to withhold it. And you can come back to the hospital when you can't breathe. That's what happened in COVID. All those hundreds of thousands of deaths did not have to occur. Some would have died. But they didn't have to occur. But our government and the pharmacists and the big pharma were withholding the very drugs that some were saying, this can heal. This can give life. Moving on. Boy, if this gets out there, I will be on the internet for sure, for a little bit anyway. David said unto him in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 16, thy blood be upon thy head. And so what did he do? He told his young men, kill him. So he exercised judgment. A life for a life is what he did. Now, let me move on. Believers oppose euthanasia because it violates the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, and usurps God's authority as the author of life. There's so many other things I could look at. My time's almost gone. Let me give you this. Our lives and physical bodies belong to God, the giver of life. 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20. I'm going to pick it up at verse 19. You're not your own. Glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. Is your life sacred? And the answer is what? Absolutely. My life is God's. Right? He gave me life. He is the giver of life. Another, believers are to live lives dead to themselves, dedicated to Christ for his purpose. Galatians 2, verse 20. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. We walk through life and we face challenges and difficulties. We face rejections. We face heartaches. We face sadness. We are victims. Sometimes we are the ones that make victims of others by our choices. But the reality is that every believer should have this as one of their life verses. The life which I now live is the life that God has given me. And it's my desire to use my life to glorify him. Moving on, the moral dilemma of cremation. All right, I'm not going to take a lot of time with this other than the bodies of the dead have been burned since ancient times. Let me give you a for instance. 1 Samuel chapter 31 and 12 and 13. When the young men retrieved Saul's body, it had been taken. Saul, his son's bodies were displayed on the walls of one of the Philistine cities. And some men of Israel went and they took the body and the head of Saul and they brought it back. I think they brought Saul's head back as well. And you read in verse 13, and they took their the latter part of verse 12, and they burnt them there. You know why? Because they didn't want their bodies to fall into the hands of the enemies again. Now, verse 13, and they took their bones and they buried them under a tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Now, I'm going to add to that. For 2,000 years, the church and believers have followed the tradition of the Jews in burying their dead. But if I had to go to a verse and say, here's a chapter and verse that is opposed to cremation, I can't come up with it. Because I know that they did practice burning the bodies and then taking the bones and burying the bones there. Let me see if I have another one. No, I don't there. Anybody want to comment on that? I know it may be an area that we can agree to disagree on. And I think many of us are tied to the burial of the body, the recognition of the life is not there, the life is gone. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And there might be many that would disagree on cremation versus burial. But any comments that you might have, anybody? Yes. Right, right. And again, the practice would have been burial, And really, as you look at Jewish history, it was burial. But I don't think it's necessarily. Sheila, do you have an insight on that? Yeah. Well, and there have been several studies that have shown the harvesting of organs maybe before somebody's dead. Are you aware of that? That I've removed from my license donating organs. Do what you want, but I know for a fact that organ is worth a lot of money to medical people and to the medical industry. And I know if you do some research, you'll find some horrible, horrible things of someone is convinced by the doctors your loved one's dying, there's no chance, and we can harvest the organ, yada yada. And so anyway, there's a grave danger. Yeah, Brother Tom. Right. Yeah. Yep. Yep. This is not an exciting day, is it, for Sunday school? What did you learn in Sunday school? Well, we talked about murder. Yeah. All right. Well, Brother Steve's not here, but he was telling me that they've raised the prices so much now in the funeral homes that it's almost forcing families to feel like they don't have a choice. So, anyway, I think my time is up. Let me fill in the blank real fast. Moral dilemma of grace and forgiveness. 3 times David laments the death of King Saul and his sons, even though Saul had been his enemy. Another, Christ is the model of grace and forgiveness, though. I think David modeled that in his spirit towards Saul. Saul would have done anything he could to kill him. And yet when he hears that his enemy is dead, there's a sorrow that David had, not just for Jonathan, which was understandable, but also for Saul as well. And then lastly, believers are commanded to love their enemies and forgive those who sin against them. The going through life with a bitter spirit doesn't harm the people that you're angry and bitter with, but it takes a toll on your body and your health and your spiritual well-being. And so my challenge as I close would be, we ought to be people who model grace and forgiveness. I'm going to give you 4 things and close. In my time, I have 1 minute. All right, here are the 4 principles. The first is in this matter of life and the temptation to give up on life. The first is trust God. He says, my grace is sufficient for thee. The second is choose contentment. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. That's where Paul is saying, I'm ready to go. And I'm sure if I was on death row with Paul, I would have probably said, I'm ready to go too. But Paul's answer is, no, to abide in my flesh is more needful for you. I think for me, don't underestimate how important your life is to those around you. Don't underestimate it. Thirdly, be confident in God's strength available in Christ. My life verse since college has been, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. And that means I can face the hard times, the difficult times, the times that are nothing but a time of great sorrow. But I can only do that in the power that Christ gives. And then lastly, choose joy. You ever been around people that they're like set on, they're going to be miserable, and everybody in their life is going to be miserable too? Right? I've met people like that. Not only are they miserable, but everybody around them is miserable. Here we go. Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. I don't volunteer. Lord, send a big trial to me. I have no interest in that, but I do have this confidence that I can choose joy even in the midst of sorrow. So anyway, I wish you had time to comment, but we don't. So I'm going to be quiet. I told somebody last week, by the time I'm finished with this Sunday school hour, even I'm tired of hearing me talk. So let me give you a 30-minute break or a 20-minute break. Let's pray.